we have to firstly figure out some very important facts. That is, no matter what's the value of n, the event that xn equals to 1 and the event xn equals to 0 should be mutually exclusive. Moreover, the sum of their probability should be equals to 1. Now, given by these facts, we can solve the question. Question A. The probability that x2 equals to 1. Actually, the probability that x2 equals to 1 should be divided into two conditions. That is, the probability that x2 equals 1 and the intersection of x1 equals to 1 plus the intersection of x2 equals to 1 intersects x1 equals 0. Now, in order to figure out this equation, we have just to use the conditional probability, and that should be the probability that x2 equals to 1, assuming x1 equals to 1, times the probability that x1 equals 1 plus the probability that x2 equals 1, assuming x1 equals 0, times the probability that x1 equals to 0. And the answer should be 0.64. Hence, the probability that x2 equals to 0 should be 1 minus the probability that x2 equals to 1 and should be 0.36. Now we have to figure out the question 2, and the second question is the probability that x3 equals to 1. Actually, this question is very similar to the question A, so we can use the similar equation and should be the probability that x3 equals to 1, assuming that x2 equals to 1 times the probability that x2 equals 1 plus the probability that x3 equals to 1, assuming x2 equals 0 times the probability that x2 equals to 0. And now this should be 0.592. Moreover, we can figure out the probability that x3 equals to 0 should be 1 minus the probability that x3 equals to 1 and should be 0.408. That's the answer of the question B. Now the question C is that the probability of x1 equals to 0 and assuming x3 equals to 1. This is quite a tricky problem because x3 is happening after x1, so now we have to do some transformation, and now we can transform this equation given by the conditional probability should be equals to the probability that x1 equals to 0 and the intersection of x3 equals to 1 divided by the probability that x3 equals 1. Actually, the denominator we have already known, we just have to figure out the numerator. Actually, the numerator should be transformed into this notation, that is the probability that x3 equals to 1, assuming x1 equals to 0, times the probability that x1 equals to 0, then divided by the probability that x3 equals to 1. Now we have just to figure out this denominator. And the second part we have already know. Now we have to figure out the first part. The first part, that the probability that x3 equals to 1, assuming x1 equals to 0, should be expanded as the following form should be the probability that x3 equals to 1, assuming that x2 equals to 1, times the probability that x2 equals 1, assuming that x1 equals to 0, plus the probability that x3 equals to 1, assuming x2 equals 0, times the probability that x2 equals to 0, assuming x1 equals to 0, and should be 0.52. Now we can figure out the probability that x1 equals to 0, assuming x3 equals to 1, should be roughly 0.176. That's the answer of the third question. Now we have to figure out the last question, the question D. Actually, we know that when n is approximately to the unlimited, Actually, the probability that xn equals to 0 should be the same of the probability that xn minus 1 equals to 0. Moreover, the probability that xn equals to 1 should be equals to the probability that xn minus 1 equals to 1. Now, given by this equation, we can assume that the probability that xn equals to 0 is x. Actually, we already know that xn equals to 1 and xn equals to 0 are mutually exclusive, so the probability that xn equals to 1 should be 1 minus x. We just use the notation x. Now we can construct the equation that the probability that xn equals to 1 should be the probability that xn equals to 0 and the intersection of xn minus 1 equals to 0 plus the probability that xn equals to 0 and the intersection of xn minus 1 equals to 1. And now we can use the conditional probability equation again, and that should be the probability that xn equals to 1, assuming that n minus 1 equals to 0, times the probability that xn minus 1 equals to 0, plus the probability that xn equals to 1, assuming that xn minus 1 equals to 1, times the probability that xn minus 1 equals 1. And now we have figured out the equation is x equals to the 0.6x plus 0.3 times 1 minus x. Hence, x should be 3 divided by 7. And that's the answer of this question. That's all. Thanks.